I have here a Matek F405-WMN flight controller, which is very similar to the 405 wing, just a smaller form factor. I like this because it's smaller, it's lighter, and it has pretty much all the same features as a 405 wing, just not as many connection points. So this is good for an airplane, a simple airplane. I've got one of these in my Rebel GT and also in my Goblin. I can never remember the name of that. But I'm going to show an example of this in the airplane because it's easier to see than some of my other installations. But you can see that it has a lot of the same connection points. It's got some of the TX and RX lines that you've seen in the previous one. And you can see the SDA and SCL lines, which are part of the I2C interface. And then there's a couple other things like RSSI and SBus. And there's connections around different sides of this. So for example, over here, there's LED, which I'm not using, then another UART connection, and camera and video transmitter connections. And then over on this side, we have servo connections. So there's 4 servo connections here. Basically ailerons, elevator. I don't know if throttle is on there. Probably not. But I think I'm also using the pan and tilt, or not pan and tilt, but the pan camera on here. So you have 4 servo connections there. There's a few more across the top here, but you need power and ground to accompany those. But there's essentially, looks like 9 connections for servos. So here's an example of the 405-WMN installed in my ZOHD Talon GT Rebel. Great camera work here. So if you look down through these wires, you can see that I've added pins, soldered pins onto the board so I can plug in all of these things with pretty much standard servo connectors. Now there's a couple of connections here that are 4-pin connectors. I'll pull one out. So this has 4 pins on it, and this is going out to the receiver. And I have 4 lines from the receiver because I have power, ground, transmit, and receive. And this is plugging into a UART. And according to the connection here, it looks like it's hard to read from here. RX2, TX2. So it's UART2, I believe. Or maybe I'm wrong there. Yeah, that's right. So these white wires are the transmit and receive lines. And that's just the way that I have this crossfire receiver configured. I think I can do SBus as well, which has a single line, I think. But that's connected to there. And then the next one over here is also a 4-pin connector right next to it. And that's connected to these lines here. Looks like UART 4. So if we look in the configuration on Inav, we'll see that that GPS is connected to UART 4. And the GPS is actually located under this cover here. And there you can see the GPS antenna sticking up. And it's just got a 4-connector cable coming from there to that 4-pin header in there connected to the flight controller. On the back here you can see that I've got an XT60 connector that runs back to the ESC for the motor. And those wires, I think they're 16 gauge, maybe 14 gauge, maybe 12 gauge, I don't know. No, they're not 12. But I've soldered those directly onto the ESC pads. If you look closely on this one here, you can see that the ESC pads are down here. And then I've got the battery coming in to a couple of these pads as well. So I have another XT connector on here for the battery connecting to this power board on the bottom. So there's the receiver, GPS, power, ESC, and then there's a connection here that's going back to the ESC for the control signal. So this is the throttle. And it looks like this is connected to somewhere underneath. So I think there's pads on this lower board here inside for driving the ESC. Now you'll notice, if you can see in here, this power line is cut. I don't want to connect the power line to the flight controller because the ESC has a 5-volt BEC on it, which is supplying 5 volts from the BEC to this red line here. I don't want to connect that to the flight controller because I've already got power coming in from the battery. It has its own 5-volt BEC on there, and that can create a problem. You can potentially burn something up. So it's always good to just have the ground and signal lines to the board and make sure you don't connect the power line from the ESC to the board. Up here you can see that there is a label that's coming off for the video transmitter. So I've got the video transmitter running out to the wing, and there's only 3 lines there because I'm only using power, ground, and the video signal. I'm not using audio. I don't know if this transmitter has an audio input, but I don't have audio running out to there. It probably does, but I don't have a microphone on board. So that just connects to the board. I know this is really hard to see. It connects to the board on the VTX connection. So there's ground, power, and VTX. And this power comes directly off the battery, so it's ground and battery voltage. So you have to make sure that your transmitter can take the power directly off the battery, because I run a 4S 2P battery in here, so that's a 16-volt battery. So you have to make sure that your video transmitter can handle that. I have some other video transmitters from RMRC that only run on 12 volts. So I have to run a 12-volt BEC out of here to the video transmitter to avoid burning it up, because it won't handle 16 volts. But this one does. I have a different video transmitter in here. I can just plug it directly into the 16 volts, or the battery voltage. I think it can take up to 4 or 6S, maybe even. And then there's a camera input here and a camera input here, and you can see that there are, maybe you can see, but there's two lines here that are running up to the front, and I have 2 cameras in the front. They're on a pan servo, so I have a forward-facing camera and a rear-facing camera, and the flight controller allows me to switch between these 2 cameras. So I can set up a switch in the configuration to do that. Up here we have 4 servo connections. I have one running to the front for the pan servo for those cameras. And then I have one running to the back for the rudder servo. I have actually 2 running to the back to the rudder servos, because there's controls on the V-tail there for left and right. And then I have a Y cable connected to the last input here, which goes to the ailerons in the wings. So I've got 1 servo output that are driving the aileron servos. So the ailerons are not driven independently, they're driven off a Y cable. And then this connector here, this connector down here, runs to a beeper. So this particular flight controller has a separate board here that has a beeper on it, which you can turn on and off with this switch. And it also has a USB-C connector, and this is where you connect to the computer to configure your flight controller. And that's it. That pretty much covers all of the connections to this board. So at this point, we could plug it into the computer, plug the flight controller into the computer, and take a look at it in Inav. You'll hear these beeps on startup, and when it's ready, it'll beep 3 times. So the beeper is useful in getting information about what the flight controller is doing. And if there's a problem, you'll hear a different beep. You know, it's telling you various things about what it's doing. And you can always turn the switch off if you get annoyed by the beeper like I do. So let's just open Inav Configurator and take a peek. It should show up as a COM port, and there it goes, and I'll connect. And now there's a few things that you'll want to set up in here before you do anything. There's a little icon here for settings for the configurator itself. So you click on that, it'll give you this screen here. And there's some preferences up here if you want to receive notifications, if Inav application has been updated and whatnot. But the one I'm interested in mostly here is this setting. When you first install this, it will be set to metric by default. So I like to set it to imperial because I'm familiar with miles and feet instead of meters, kilometers, decimeters, and centimeters. So I like to have it set to imperial so that I can see feet and miles in the UI. And there's a separate setting for the flight controller itself for imperial versus metric. So if you have one set to imperial and one set to metric, it gets really confusing. So you have to make sure they're both set the way you prefer them to be. So a few things up here, you can see that there's a GPS icon, and it's blue, which indicates that the GPS is talking to the flight controller. There's also some pre-arming checks here on this setup screen, which is the default screen that you'll see when you connect. And it says navigation is safe. That's only because the GPS does not have a lock. So I'm indoors, so it's unlikely that I'm going to get a GPS lock. But if you go down to the GPS tab here, it'll show you how many satellites you have. Right now it's not seeing any. So I don't have a latitude or longitude coordinate. So I don't have any idea where I am, or the flight controller doesn't. There's some other settings up here like time zone offset. Arizona's -7 hours. So if you want to use the time in your OSD, which I kind of like to do, it'll show you the correct local time. And then there's some GPS settings up here. I'm not going to get into that right now. But in order to enable GPS, you have to go into configuration and scroll down here. There's an option for GPS for navigation and telemetry. Make sure that's on, and that will tell the flight controller that you have a GPS, and it will try to communicate with it and set up the GPS. If you don't have this on, there's some options that don't even show up in the UI. For example, in the OSD, if you want to see the longitude and latitude coordinates in the goggles, in the OSD, those options won't even be there if you don't have the GPS enabled. But this up here is telling you that the GPS is talking to the flight controller successfully. And if you scroll down in here somewhere, there's GPS options. So these are all the OSD options that you can configure or add to your OSD. I have a very cluttered display here. You can trim this down to bare bones minimum or select alternative views that you can configure with a switch if you want to see different levels of data. So I have a lot of things that are enabled here that you probably don't even need. But this GPS section won't even show up in this OSD page if you don't have GPS enabled. And there's a lot of things like that, like Crossfire, etc. But if you go up into the ports tab, you can see, if you remember, the Crossfire receiver was attached to UART2. So UART2 for Crossfire to work is set to our serial RX, and it's running at 115,200 baud. That's just the speed at which it communicates, and that's bits per second. So it's 115,200 bits per second that it's communicating. And then the GPS is configured on UART4. So you have to enable the GPS on the configuration page, define what port it's on here, add it to your OSD if you want, and then the GPS will show up under here. Once you do get a lock, it'll show you on the map where you are. And I'm just not going to get a lock here indoors. And that's pretty typical. Unless you have a really good GPS, you quite frequently will not get a lock indoors. I'm not getting any satellites, which kind of concerns me, because usually I'll get a few. So I don't know if I've disrupted anything. But there's quite a few configuration steps that we need to go through to get your aircraft up and running. The GPS is a big one. Getting your receiver configured on the ports tab is a big one. And the really big one is the modes for setting up all your switches to enable your different flight modes. And then programming, you might have a few things in there, which I have for disabling the pan if I'm within 50 feet of the ground or certain distance from home, whatnot. And I also have a setting in here to prevent disarm during flight, which I have done a couple of times. Well, I did it once, and then I configured this so I wouldn't do that again. So that's pretty much all that I'm going to cover in this video. And as usual, let me know in the comments if there's anything else that you want to know or that I missed. Whatever you want to say in the comments, feel free. And with that, thank you for watching, and happy flying. And always remember to disconnect.